The subject of this episode continues the conversation which we started in the previous episode about the books of the Bible. And we will discuss today the question, which book of the Bible is the easiest to start reading. And in order to understand the answer to this question, we need to continue looking at the structures of different books of the Bible, but from the standpoint of their literary genre. And that's very important. The books of the Bible are not the same. Not every book of the Bible is written in the same way. And that is very important when we try to understand the meaning of a specific text. Because, of course, the text needs to be understood in its context. But depending on the type of the book, the context will be structured differently. And so this is why it's important to understand the genre. So I will start with the easiest books of the Bible and classify them by their literary genre. So we can basically break down the books of the Bible into two major categories of the genres, the prose and the poetry. So let's start with the prose. And the easiest one is historical narrative. This is basically the history which Bible tells us. For example, the book of Genesis, it's all the history. It starts with the history of creation, the flood, the patriarchs, and so forth. So this is going to be very important to understand how the Bible looks at the earth history. And so we have historical books. Actually, when we look at even the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, not, sometimes people are confused when they see in English Bible the statement or the reference to the law of Moses. Well, Torah is not exactly a legal document. It has its legal part, but it also has its historical narrative part. And the historical narrative part is the book of Genesis. It's a half of the book of Exodus. You have some history in the book of Numbers, the stories, and also the first half of the book of Deuteronomy retells the history of Exodus. And then, of course, we have the books of Joshua, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and also 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. When you look at these books, they are the Bible history. And it is very important for you to start reading those books. And sometimes people ask me question whether or not it's good to read Bible in chronological order. It's more complex. To answer this question is a little bit more complex. But what I can advise here, anyone who wants to remember and know the Bible text, you have to start reading the Bible history, meaning you start from the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is the beginning, the history of how it all started, and you make your way through the period before the flood, the period of patriarchs, the Exodus. Then you go into Joshua, which is the conquest of Canaan. Then you go Judges, which is written also by prophet Samuel, the period of Judges. Then you go Samuel and Kings, which is King David, and then all the kings of Israel before the exile. The books of Samuel and the book of Kings is also helpful to read in parallel with the book of Chronicles, which kind of go over the same Bible history, but some details complement each other. And then you go into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that will complete your biblical history of Israel, or maybe rephrase it, history of biblical Israel. So it will get you, so reading in the Tanakh, now you know what it is, the Torah, the prophets, and the writing. These books, starting with Genesis all the way to Ezra and Nehemiah, will take you from approximately roughly third millennium BC, all the way to around 5th century BC. So it will take you a period. It will be a good 2,500 year period of earth history, focusing on the history of God's people. A very similar historical genre we have in the writings of the apostles, in the testimonies, and that is the book of Acts. Basically, that is the book of that book tells us the history of what happens after Jesus. Very important book. And by the way, this is probably the easiest to read books of the Bible. You start from Genesis and all the way through Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Acts. Somebody will ask me, what about the life of Jesus? What about the Gospels? The Gospels are the same way as the Torah. Torah has several genres in them. Gospels have several genres in them. And I will be talking about this in our next in the next installation of our lectorium. But let me continue explaining to you the different genres. And the second prosaic genre is actually apocalyptic visions. There are two apocalyptic books in the Bible that are written in prose. This is the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And they're actually connected with each other. You can't understand the book of Revelation without knowing the book of Daniel. But what are these two books? These two books are the description of the vision. Also, these visions, they are mainly concerned the history of humanity. That is very important. The book of Daniel starts with the history of ancient Near East and shows the future. And the book of Revelation continues this. Somebody will say, whoa, isn't the book of Revelation the most difficult book of the Bible? Actually, it is not as difficult as you think. Both books, Daniel and Revelation, are actually very easy to read if, of course, you understand the history of ancient world. And for that, of course, if you had difficulties, you want to take some encyclopedias and things like this to understand what's the ancient Egypt, what's the ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Persia, and all this. I do love to take my students to British Museum. That's probably the best place to go, where you can walk around this hall and learn ancient history and see the ancient artifacts. So yes, indeed, I want to give you a little tip for today, and I hope you will be able to appreciate this tip, because the tip would be the Bible is a history. So in order to understand the Bible, you need to have some understanding of the history. The Bible does tell you the history of the world. In fact, the Bible record is probably the most complete and consistent and detailed record of the world history. And through history, God reveals to us the story of redemption. This is why, for today, good luck in your study of the Scripture.